Welcome everybody to Tokens of Wisdom. I'm your host, Dave Rothschild, a partner at Cole, Freeman & Malin, a boutique law firm based in San Francisco with one of the leading private fund practices on the West Coast. Now, before we dive into the episode today, please listen to the disclaimer at the end of the show. Nothing I say here is legal advice, investment advice, or tax advice. I know you know that already, but I'm going to say it every single time. So, let's dive into it. Today is part 2 of our hedge fund offering terms series, and today we're going to be talking about liquidity or withdrawal mechanics. Really exciting stuff. Great follow-up to our discussion last time on compensation terms. So, quick lead in, a hedge fund is an open-ended fund vehicle, so it is going to offer periodic liquidity to its investors. Unlike a closed-ended fund vehicle where there are no withdrawals allowed for the entire life of the fund, a hedge fund, an open-ended fund, allows periodic withdrawals. Now, you might set that cadence at different frequencies. It might be monthly, it might be quarterly, semi-annually, annually, every 2 years, every 3 years. I think for most hedge funds, the monthly or quarterly liquidity is quite common. Most common, I would say. But depending on the assets you're investing in, what your strategy is, you might get away with less frequent withdrawals. So there are a number of withdrawal mechanisms that you might impose on your fund, notwithstanding the general liquidity cadence that we just talked about. So in addition to, restricting withdrawals to monthly, quarterly, whatever, you might have a lockup period, you might have a gate mechanism, you might have side pockets, and there are various permutations of each of these provisions. And so we're going to talk about each one fairly quickly, one by one. So first is a lockup period. Now, anytime we're talking about withdrawal mechanics in a hedge fund, there's a bit of a tension between the manager and the investors, right? The manager's goal generally is to keep assets in the fund. And so ideally, they don't want people making withdrawals. The investor's goal is to have as much flexibility with their capital as possible. So if they put money in a fund, they want to know that they can get that money out if they need it for some reason, or if the fund is not performing the way they want, or if something is wrong with the manager, etc. So there's an inherent tension there. And I think, at base, the manager can get away with more restrictions if there is some rational justification for those restrictions. The most obvious rational justification for a liquidity restriction that you impose on your investors is if your underlying portfolio, the assets your fund is invested in, have some liquidity restriction of their own. Obviously, if it's difficult or impossible for you to satisfy a withdrawal request, it is more reasonable for you to limit the ability of an investor to make that request. And so the liquidity profile of your fund should be tied in some way to the liquidity profile of the underlying assets you're actually investing in. Otherwise, there's going to be a mismatch, and you're going to have a hard time justifying to your investors why you need a 5-year lockup period in a fund that's only investing in public equities, for example. So let's talk about these various mechanisms one by one. Let's start with a lockup period. So a lockup period is exactly what it sounds like. It is a period of time during which your capital is locked up, which means you can't touch it. Investors are naturally a little bit leery of lockup periods, but managers of liquid strategies can get away with some lockup period because I think it's legitimate for a manager to expect some minimum time commitment from an investor. Let's say 1 year, for example. You could imagine being a manager having some hesitation to allowing investors to just kind of be tourists in their fund, dip their toe in the water for a couple months, and then immediately pull that capital back out as soon as something goes wrong or that investor gets nervous. And so for that reason, a manager can often get away with having a 1-year lockup period, for example, in a fund that is otherwise liquid because they want investors to demonstrate some minimum commitment to the fund. It is not cost-free to accept capital into a fund, right? There's some administrative process in accepting the capital, in having investors fill out subdocs. That investor is taking up a slot in your fund that might be relevant to investor counting purposes under various regulations that the manager or the fund are subject to. There are filing requirements that might have to be made in respect of investors coming in from new states. And so there is a cost to each investor that you bring into the fund. Tax prep, K1 generation. And so to expect that an investor is going to spend a minimum amount of time in your fund is not unreasonable. So as we're talking about the withdrawal mechanics of your fund, when we go through my handy fund questionnaire, like we talked about last time, once we get to the withdrawal section, I'm going to ask if you want a lockup period. And you're either going to say yes or no. And if you say yes, I want a lockup period, I'm going to have a few follow-up questions for you. First, how long should that lockup period be? And we might have a discussion about marrying your lockup period to the liquidity characteristics of your fund. Second, does the lockup period apply only to an investor's initial subscription, or does it apply to every subscription your investor makes? So let's say I invest, it's almost July. Let's say I invest on July 1st, 1 year lockup period. I make my first withdrawal a year later after I've been in the fund for a year. I take out a little bit because I want to go on a fancy vacation to the south of France and I need a little extra money to pay for that vacation. Fair enough. Now, your fund is performing very well, so I want to put more money in. Now, a month after I've made my withdrawal, I subscribe again. I contribute an additional amount to the fund. Is that additional amount now subject to a new 1 year lockup period, or am I done with the lockup period because I've already proven to you that I'm not a tourist in your fund and I've satisfied your minimum time period requirement? That's really up to you, and it's up to what you think your investors will accept. Okay, so length of time. Does it apply to every subscription or only the first? And then the last question I'm going to ask about lockups is it hard or soft? Now, a hard lockup period is theoretically not changeable, right? So a hard lockup period says you're locked up for a year and there's no explicit out. There's no explicit way to get out of the lockup period. A soft lockup period is just a little bit softer. And by that, I mean there is an explicit mechanism by which you could break the lockup period if you pay a fee. So usually the way a soft lockup period works is it says, okay, there's a 1 year lockup period. However, you can withdraw from the fund earlier before the expiration of the lockup if you pay a small penalty. Call it 2%, 3% of the amount of proceeds you're trying to withdraw. And then that penalty gets paid into the fund and spread around the other investors. So that's a soft lockup. It's a little bit more palatable to folks because they know there is a mechanism that they can employ to get out of the fund if they really need to. And other investors might be heartened a little bit because they get a little extra kicker from that penalty. Now, I emphasized the word explicit before when I talked about the hard versus the soft, because every time I would draft fund documents, unless a client directed me explicitly otherwise, I would build in the ability for them to waive the lockup period in specific instances. So that might happen if you have a big seed investor who comes in and is willing to write a check sufficiently large, but they want a shorter lockup period, or they want you to waive the lockup period altogether. Some consideration needs to be paid to exercising a manager's discretion to waive a lockup period. You know, if your portfolio truly is not that liquid and you grant one investor more favorable liquidity terms than you grant to investors writ large, that might be unfair to the investors overall. It might be something that you need to either specifically disclose or avoid doing altogether. So that's something you should talk about with your lawyer. And this is one of the many reasons why I disclaim giving you legal advice in these videos. So really, that's a lockup period. That's all there is to it. There's a handful of mechanisms, and that's that. Now, once you've determined whether or not you're going to have a lockup period and how it's going to work, I'm going to ask you, how frequently can investors withdraw? Now, this is the periodicity that we were talking about earlier. Most liquid funds offer monthly or quarterly withdrawals, but sometimes they're semi-annually or annually. In theory, they could be every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. You can set it to whatever period you want, and if investors are willing to accept that, then you're good to go. In addition to the periodicity, you have to tell investors how much notice they have to give before the withdrawal date. So if you have monthly liquidity, maybe you're going to require 30 days notice. If you have quarterly liquidity, maybe you're going to require a little bit longer notice. If you have annual liquidity, maybe you're going to require even more notice. But usually there's some notice period investors have to give. And if they send in written notice before the deadline to do so under the fund documents, then their withdrawal will generally be satisfied as of the next withdrawal date. So that's the periodicity and the notice requirement. The next mechanism we should talk about is side pockets. Now, side pockets are probably not appropriate for strategies that are totally liquid. But for strategies that are mostly liquid but might have a handful of illiquid positions, maybe you're a public equities fund investing in biotech stocks and you want to participate in a few pipe deals. Or maybe you have a digital asset strategy that's mostly liquid, but maybe you're going to participate in a few token issuances that are going to be subject to lockup periods. And so if you have some assets that you can't liquidate, then you have to be able to account for those in the liquidity mechanics for your fund. Otherwise, you're going to run into a scenario where investors want out and you're unable to generate the proceeds to pay them the withdrawals that you've committed to giving them under the terms of your fund documents. And that's something you want to avoid. So one potential mechanism to solve for this is a side pocket mechanism. Side pocket mechanism is really, think of it like an accounting trick. You're saying, okay, notwithstanding all of the liquidity provisions that are in these fund documents, notwithstanding that I generally offer monthly liquidity on 30 days notice, I'm going to take my illiquid positions and I'm going to put them off to the side. I'm going to account for them separately on the books of the fund. And when you make a withdrawal request, your withdrawal request cannot touch these side pocketed assets. These are set off to the side until I decide that they're sufficiently liquid to go back into the fund's main portfolio and be subject to its regular liquidity mechanics. It's almost like you're taking a small portion of a liquid fund and making it totally illiquid. You're telling your investors, okay, I'm investing in this private position, in this private stock. It is not a liquid position, and until it becomes a liquid position, you may not make withdrawals from the fund that are attributable to your position in this stock. Usually, these positions are totally segregated on the books. So if I'm in the fund when the position is taken, I participate in it, and people who come into the fund later don't participate in it. Investors don't love side pocket mechanisms in liquid funds for the obvious reason that it further hampers them from getting their money out. And so oftentimes, if a fund is going to have a side pocket mechanism, it's going to be limited in some respects. So maybe the fund documents say that no more than 20% of the fund can be side pocketed at any one time. Or maybe an investor negotiates that, hey, I'm going to invest in your fund, but I'm not comfortable with this side pocket idea, so none of my capital account will be allocated to side pockets. All of this is possible. Side pockets are a great mechanism for otherwise liquid strategies that might have a few illiquid positions, but I think they become to get more cumbersome the more illiquid the positions in the fund are, and investors are always a little bit leery about side pocket mechanisms. So another way to limit withdrawals is by instituting a gate. And a gate is an entirely separate mechanism that restricts the capital that can outflow from a fund. So a gate comes in two different flavors. One is applied at the investor level, and another is applied at the full fund level. So a gate, in broad strokes, says that no more than X% can be withdrawn on any withdrawal date. And so if that applies to one investor, you're telling your investors, okay, Dave, you have $1 million in the fund. I have a 20% investor level gate. That means that on any withdrawal date, you cannot withdraw more than $200,000, 20% of your total investment. A gate that applies on a fund-wide basis is the same thing. It just applies to the full amount of capital in the fund. So if there's $100 million in the fund and a 20% fund level gate, that means on any withdrawal date, no more than 20 million can be withdrawn. And if the fund receives requests for withdrawals in excess of that gate percentage, they just withdraw everybody pro rata so that only the 20 million goes out of the fund that date, and then all those other withdrawal requests are punted to the next withdrawal date, whether that's the next month, the next quarter, the next semi-annual date, whatever it might be. That's generally how gates work. Again, just like lockup periods and side pocket mechanics, investors don't love gates. I think managers are better able to sell fund level gates as an investor protective mechanism than they are able to sell investor level gates. You can make the argument that a fund level gate is investor protective because you're trying to prevent a run on the fund. You can imagine a scenario where an investor has a relatively volatile strategy. Maybe it's a digital asset based strategy and the price of crypto assets can be quite volatile. You don't want your investors to get spooked and take all the money out of the fund after there's been one especially bad month, because you're quite confident that in the next few months things are gonna tick back up and you're gonna make back that money and more. And so if there's a run on the fund and everybody takes their money out on one specific withdrawal date, maybe it's no longer viable for you to run this strategy. Maybe you have to shut down the fund altogether. And so it's protective of the investors who want to stick it out and see you recover from that drawdown to have some sort of gate mechanism, at least in theory. that applies on a fund-wide basis. And you're able to sell it that way sometimes also. Just like with lockup periods, I would typically draft the documents to be permissive for the manager to exercise its discretion to waive the application of certain of these restrictions as they apply to a given investor. And, sometimes that will happen. I think one other common provision in a withdrawal section of private fund documents is an audit holdback. And the audit holdback basically says, if you withdraw all of your capital from the fund, I'm going to pay you 90 or 95% of your capital account balance. I'm going to hold back that remaining 5% until I finish the audit for the year in which your withdrawal occurs, just in case there's an audit adjustment and something was miscalculated. The reason you do that is, once you send that money out to LPs, it's very hard to get it back if there is an audit adjustment. Audit adjustments are quite rare, so it's unlikely to occur, but you don't want to find yourself holding the bag in that case. And these are the primary liquidity mechanisms and liquidity terms that you might put into a hedge fund offering. So I think we've covered the basics, and talk to you later. Bye. Well, now that all that boring stuff's out of the way, it's time for the part you've all been waiting for. The legal disclaimer. In this show, I describe laws and regulations from a 10,000-foot view. And while this should be obvious to most, I need to say it nonetheless. This show is for informational purposes only, and nothing I say here constitutes legal, investment, or tax advice. If you're thinking about starting a fund or you're curious about your options, this show is a good resource. But if you're going to pull the trigger and launch a fund, please engage an attorney to assist you. Thanks for listening to Tokens of Wisdom with Dave Rothschild. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts.